Hi everyone, this video is going to be covering session 13, which considers the effectiveness of demand side and supply side policies. Specifically, up until now we have been looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and we have spoken a little bit about expansionary or contractionary monetary and fiscal policies and how that will affect the demand for goods and services in the economy and how that can affect the equilibrium. So the point of this session is to reinforce some of that material that we have already covered, and in particular to compare the effectiveness of demand-side policies under the assumptions of the Keynesian and the classical aggregate supply curves. We will then also extend this to understand the process and implications of something called supply-side policies, and then finally we'll look at how aggregate demand and aggregate supply interact with each other over the long run. Alright, so if we think about the demand side policy under different supply assumptions, we can think about the two extreme cases of aggregate supply. Recall that in the Keynesian case, the diagram on the left hand side, if we are considering how goods and services are supplied under an economy where there is extensive unemployment, the aggregate supply curve would be horizontal, indicating that firms would be able to supply whatever quantity is demanded at a given price level. And so that horizontal aggregate supply curve can then also be thought of as a more short-run aggregate supply curve, because in the short run we would think or argue that there would be enough or a lot of unemployment around, so that when firms are faced with the need to expand their output, they are easily able to do so with only a limited, if any, effect on their marginal costs of production. The Keynesian case on the right-hand side is quite different to that because it represents the other extreme, and you can see that what's drawn in there is a vertical aggregate supply curve. That vertical aggregate supply curve is indicating that the economy is operating at the full employment level of production and outputs. In other words, the economy is using all of its resources to its fullest potential. That means that in this economy, which would be a more long-run version of how the economy could look, if all of the factors of production are being used to their fullest potential, then it would be very, very difficult for an economy to expand their outputs beyond the equilibrium level of output in the long run. In other words, in the long run, the demand for goods and services will determine the price at which those goods and services are sold, but it isn't really going to affect how much output is produced. So what I want to do is to just illustrate and talk through these diagrams using the document camera. So I'm not going to be drawing anything different to what's already in the slides, but I think it's just useful to reinforce the concepts by going through the diagrams in more detail. So we're going to start, we'll do it just as appears on the slide. So we're going to start with the Keynesian case, and I'm going to draw in the axes. Recall that with aggregate demand and aggregate supply on the horizontal axis, we're measuring real output, and on the vertical axis, we're measuring the price level. In the Keynesian case, because we would argue that there is extensive unemployment, as was the case at the time when John Maynard Keynes was writing about the economy, that gives rise to a horizontal aggregate supply curve. Okay? And what this is suggesting is that in this economy, a low quantity of output could be supplied at a price of P, or a high quantity of output could be supplied at a price of P. In other words, firms are able to supply whatever quantity of goods and services is demanded at an existing price level. What this then means then is that the position of the aggregate demand curve is going to determine how much output is produced. So if aggregate demand is AD1, then Y1 will be the amount of output produced at a price level of P. If the demand for goods and services increases, from 81 to say 82, and I'm not detailing specifically what could cause the increase in the aggregate demand for goods and services. Essentially, an increase in the demand for goods and services could be caused by expansionary monetary or fiscal policies, or by boosts in investor or consumer confidence. And for more detail about exactly how those things work, you need to go back and look at the previous video, which was covered in sessions 11 and 12. So for now, if the demand for goods and services increases in this economy, the new equilibrium would be at B. And at B, the level of output is able to increase to Y2. So in the Keynesian case, if there is an increase in the demand for goods and services, and the aggregate demand curve shifts from 81 to 82, representing that increase in the demand for goods and services, then what we could argue is that in the very short run, or in an economy which is characterized by lots and lots of unemployment, it would be possible in this economy for output to increase from Y1 all the way to Y2 without this affecting the equilibrium price level. This is because when the demand for goods and services increases and that excess demand is created, firms will be able to expand their production in order to meet the excess demand and they wouldn't experience an increase in their marginal costs of production. They would be able to hire workers who are currently unemployed and bring them into their production processes with no additional marginal cost incurred. This then means that their average cost of production wouldn't change, and therefore that would have no effect on the price level that they are charging for the goods and services which are produced. So what we can then say about the Keynesian case is that increases in aggregate demand are effective, just writing this out, effective at increasing real output without changing prices. Okay? And we can see that output increases when the demand for goods and services increases with no change in the price level. As I've mentioned in a previous slide, in the very short run, you'll sometimes see it referred to that prices are very sticky. In other words, prices are not changing in the short run. We contrast that with the classical case. So in the classical case, we're still measuring real output. On the horizontal axis and the price level on the vertical axis. But now, when we draw in the aggregate supply curve is vertical. And we can sometimes even see that explicitly referred to as the long run aggregate supply curve. And in the long run aggregate supply curve, we're assuming that the goods and services which are being produced by all of the resources, all of the inputs in the economy. Specifically, all of those inputs are being used to their fullest potential to produce the amount of output Y star. We sometimes also see that referred to as the level of potential output. In this economy, the level of demand for goods and services, pen didn't work so well, the demand for goods and services will determine the price at which that output will be sold. Okay? So when the demand for goods and services is at a level 81 and output is Y star, the price at which that output will be purchased and sold is P1. If there is an increase in the demand for goods and services, again this could be because of expansionary monetary or fiscal policies, or because of boosts in consumer or investor confidence. When there is an expansion in the demand for goods and services, let me just extend this out, then at the existing price level, there will be this excess good demand for goods and services created, But firms in the long run would not be able to expand the amount of output that they produce beyond the potential level of output. So although there is an increase in the demand for goods and services at the existing price level, Y1 is demanded, Y star is supplied, the excess demand is going to effectively raise the price level in the economy. And as prices start to rise, this will cause a decrease in the quantity of goods and services demanded, so there's an upward movement along the aggregate demand curve. In this case, though, the rise in the price level cannot act as an incentive for firms to expand production because they have no additional resources available with which to expand production. So here, if we think about how the equilibrium changes, in this economy, the equilibrium will change from point A to point B. When there is an increase in the demand for goods and services, in the long run, it is not possible for firms to expand the amount of output that they produce because they do not have additional resources with which to produce that additional output. That means that in the long run, when there's an increase in the demand for goods and services, the only effect that that will have is to raise the price level. So what we can say about the long run then is that increases in the demand for goods and services are ineffective at increasing real output. The only change is in terms of the price level, which increases. And here, another way of thinking about it is to suggest that prices are not sticky because they adjust fully. They adjust fully to changes. Just push this up, to changes in aggregate demand. Okay. So on the left-hand side, the Keynesian case is the short-run case. Expansionary demand-side policies are very effective at changing the level of output without changing prices. Prices are sticky. On the right-hand side, the classical case, an increase in the demand for goods and services will be ineffective at increasing the level of output in the long run, and the only effect of an increase in the demand for goods and services will be to raise the price level. Here, prices are not sticky at all. They adjust fully to changes in aggregate demand. What I also just want to point out to you is that we can also think about the demand for goods and services changing in the opposite direction. And here, decreases in aggregate demand would be effective at decreasing output without changing prices, although why in an economy you would want to implement a contractionary policy to decrease output if that's not going to have any effect on the price level would be a little bit strange. So in the short run, where output is flexible and where prices do not change, it's much more likely that expansionary policies will be implemented. In the long run, though, if an economy was overheated and if prices were very, very high, then contractionary policies to decrease the level of aggregate demand would be quite useful, because although they won't affect the level of output, real output won't change. When real output doesn't change, the thing is that prices will decrease. Sorry, I've just noticed that I've written it wrong here. Oh no, I haven't. Increases in aggregate demand are ineffective at increasing real output. Exactly. So in the long run, an increase in the aggregate demand for goods and services will not affect the level of real output, but only changes in terms of the price level, which increases. And therefore, a contractionary policy, which decreases the level of demand for goods and services, if prices are too high, implementing a contractionary policy in this sort of economy would be very, very good, because it wouldn't have a negative effect on output, but it will cause a decrease in prices. So in an economy in the long run, if inflation is too high, a contractionary fiscal or monetary policy will be a good example or a good way to reduce inflationary pressure. Alright, let's switch back quickly to the slides to see where we go from here. Current slide. Okay. So it has surprisingly been argued that South Africa could be an example of the classical case. Now you might be thinking to yourself, what do you mean, South Africa as an example of the classical case? South Africa has such widespread unemployment. How could we argue that South Africa is close to achieving its full employment level of production and output? And this is where the idea that many of the people or of the population who are unemployed might actually be structurally unemployed comes to the fore. If you recall, it's been argued, or it could be argued, that people who are without jobs and who actually lack the skills or qualifications to obtain the jobs which are available in the economy, we identify or call those people structurally unemployed. Those people cannot obtain work because they do not have the requisite skills, they do not have the requisite qualifications to obtain the jobs that are available. Therefore, it could be argued that in South Africa, where there is such widespread unemployment, and where often the people who are unemployed because they cannot obtain jobs, because they do not have the requisite skills or qualifications, it could be argued that because South Africa has such a large structural unemployment problem, that South Africa is close to achieving its full employment level of production and output, given the existing quantity and quality of its factors of production. South Africa could improve its level of output by improving the quality of its factors of production, including the quality of its unemployed factors of production. If workers or potential workers who are unemployed were able to obtain the skills required to get jobs which are available, then they would be able to apply for those jobs and have more success at obtaining them. So in South Africa, it's really that there is a lack of critical resources which is constraining the ability of the economy to produce extra output. We have lots of resources available, but because those resources are not the sorts of resources which are required in the economy, it's been argued that in South Africa we're close to achieving our full employment level of production and output, given the quantity and the quality of our existing factors of production. That's why it's been the case that demand-side policies, for example, which perhaps try to lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy, have only had a limited effect on output and employment, and sometimes have served to exacerbate or increase the effects of inflation in the economy. Alright, let's move on to the discussion of supply-side economics. Supply-side economics moves away from explicitly looking at demand-side policies to drive the economy, and instead recognizes that really it's the production of goods and services that should be seen as the driver of the economy. And to some extent, supply-side policies link back to the Macro 1 discussion that we had on economic growth, where what we were focusing on explaining was how firms increase production in the long run. Supply-side policies encourage growth in potential outputs, and graphically that could be illustrated by a shift in the aggregate supply curve to the right. Some examples of supply-side policy measures include deregulation and privatization. Anything which reduces the amount of red tape, anything which makes it easier for firms to produce goods and services and to go about their business, would create an incentive for firms to start up and to continue their productive processes. Privatization has been argued to be much more efficient at increasing output in economies in the long run, as opposed to the nationalization of firms. And indeed, sometimes firms which are nationalized or publicly owned have been argued to be very inefficient and very cumbersome and quite wasteful of state resources. It's argued that firms which are privatized have much more incentive to be able to expand their production processes. The second thing which is good for supply-side economics is to maintain an efficient legal system. This would suggest that firms would be much more willing to invest in economies where their investments are thoroughly protected by the laws in that economy, and where if anything goes wrong, they can rely upon the legal system to help them in those situations. So maintaining an efficient legal system is argued to encourage firms to start up and again to increase production, because they can be ensured, if the legal system is efficient, that their investments will be sound and protected. Technological progress is a classic example of supply-side economics, where in an economy that experiences technological progress and is able to produce more with the same factors of production, over time, this will increase the supply of goods and services in the long run. And the final supply-side economics policy is one which is often regarded to be quite strange, specifically because it involves tax cuts. We've previously spoken about tax cuts under the auspices of demand-side policies, but supply-side economists would argue that tax cuts can also affect the supply side of the economy by creating incentives for people to join the workforce. The idea would be that there might be people who are currently unemployed or who are not supplying their labor to the market because tax rates are too high. Supply-side economists would suggest that if you cut the tax rate, those resources, those potential laborers who are currently not supplying their labor to the market because taxes are too high, if they experienced a tax cut, they would supply their labor to the market. And if they supplied their labor to the market, there would be more worker effort and productivity, and aggregate supply would increase. In addition, it's argued that tax cuts, specifically supply-side economists would argue that tax cuts will not affect tax revenues by that much. Specifically, because worker effort and productivity would increase, they would argue that tax revenues will increase when tax cuts happen rather than fall. And this radical view of the effect of a tax cut is sometimes been termed voodoo economics, and you can imagine why, just because it is quite outlandish and almost mystical to think that a tax cut could have the effects that supply-side economists argue that it does. What I want to do, there is a diagram here, but I'll talk you through the diagram using the document camera. Let's do that, and let's flip this page over. So what I'm specifically looking at here is supply-side economics, and I'll use also the example of tax cuts. So what I want to do is draw in my axes. Remember, it's real output on the horizontal axis and the price level on the vertical axis. I'm drawing in a long-run aggregate supply curve, and here I've got my potential outputs, and I'm drawing in an aggregate demand curve, AD0. And here, equilibrium in this economy would be represented by point A, prices would be P, and output would be Y star. Now, supply-side policies, with the exception of tax cuts, are policies which work to increase the long-run aggregate supply of goods and services. So, with the exception of tax cuts, supply-side policies mainly aim to affect the position of the aggregate supply curve, indicating that the level of potential output will increase over time through policies which specifically are aimed or targeted at either increasing the use of factors of production, such as using them more efficiently to produce more, or through maintaining an efficient legal system, or through deregulation and privatization, for example. Anything which creates incentives for firms to produce more output in the long run would be regarded as a supply-side policy, and this long-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. If the long-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the right, more output could be produced over time, and provided the demand for goods and services remains unchanged, that additional output could be sold at a lower price. If you just draw in this diagram and shift the aggregate supply curve to the right and observe what's happening to prices and outputs, you will see that output will increase over time while the price level will fall. What I want to do in this diagram, though, is specifically work with the example of a decrease in taxation. So, according to supply-side economists, the effect of a tax cut would be to increase the long-run aggregate supply of goods and services. Now, that would be shown as a rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve. And remember, we would be arguing that a tax cut would be drawing in previously underutilized resources, such as potential laborers or members of the labor force who were not supplying their labor to the market. So when there is a tax cut, people who were not supplying their labor to the market might be more inclined to do so. This increases the inputs that firms can access and raises the potential level of output. However, we cannot ignore that a decrease in tax cuts will also have an effect on the demand side of the economy. When taxes are cut, if you recall, this could increase disposable income, increase consumption expenditure, and that gets multiplied through the economy to cause an increase in the demand for goods and services. As I've mentioned before, tax cuts could also raise investments because firms who are benefiting from lower taxes on their profits might be more inclined to reinvest those profits in their businesses, and so investment would rise. That then gets multiplied through the economy to cause an increase in the demand for goods and services. We show that increase in the demand for goods and services as a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Now, the thing to note is that it's actually quite unlikely that tax cuts will have a very big effect on the supply of goods and services. So you'll see here, and also in the diagram in the slides, that when the aggregate supply curve is shifted to the right, it's only quite a small shift. In contrast, when the demand for goods and services is shown as changing following a tax cut, we show that as quite a big increase in aggregate demand. And that's because a tax cut can have effects through multiple channels, both by changing consumption and by changing investment, for example. So the effect of a tax cut on the economy is likely to be quite big. What we then see is that a tax cut in the economy may not have the desired effect, because even though a tax cut could potentially increase the level of potential output, it's also going to raise the price level in the economy. And so tax cuts are not the cure-all in terms of being able to increase output with a negligible effect on prices. In fact, tax cuts often have quite a big positive effect on prices. They raise prices, and they don't affect the level of output that much. In the 1960s, when Robert Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were respectively the President and the Prime Minister of the US and the UK, they implemented tax cuts in the hope that they would be able to increase their level of output and economic growth and increase employment. But what they instead found in those economies is that output and employment didn't increase that much, but prices increased dramatically. And that's because tax cuts do not usually have the desired effect on output that is expected. Tax cuts don't often raise output very much, but they do raise the demand for goods and services by a lot. And it's that increase in the demand for goods and services that then puts significant upward pressure on prices and causes big increases in inflation. All right, moving back to the slides. All right, so despite the previous example of tax cuts, supply-side policies can be very useful. It is only supply-side policies which will permanently be able to increase output. So supply-side policies such as improving the quality of laborers, supply-side policies such as deregulation and privatization, supply-side policies such as maintaining an official legal system, all of those things, and also technological improvements, don't forget about those, are the sorts of policies that can permanently increase the level of output in the economy and cause potential output to increase. Demand-side policies are useful, but for short-run results. There are economists who would support cutting taxes for the incentive effect, but they would argue that this should be undertaken with a simultaneous reduction in government expenditure. So on the one hand, you would cut taxes to try and increase the number of people working, but you would reduce government expenditure to ensure A, that tax revenues aren't compromised, and B, to mitigate against the inflation that would result as, or that would be caused as a result of the tax cuts. Alright, the final thing to think about is how the demand and the supply for goods and services interact in the long run. What the diagram here shows, let me just get a laser pointer for now. We have real output being measured on the horizontal axis. We have prices being measured on the vertical axis. And what this diagram is showing is how over time in an economy, and here specific years are being used, output in 1970, output in 1980, output in 1990, output in the 2000s, in the 2010s, and so on. What this diagram is trying to show is that over time, the supply of goods and services will increase slowly and steadily as resources are accumulated and as new inputs are identified, as the quality of factors of production are improved, as systems are improved to increase or maintain legal systems, and as deregulation and privatization happens, all of these things will act as incentives for firms to expand production over time. In addition, technological improvements will also result in increases in the supply of goods and services over time, because technological improvements mean that firms can use their existing factors of production more efficiently to produce more. The other thing which happens over time, though, is that the demand for goods and services must typically steadily increase in order to ensure that firms have the continued incentive to supply the additional goods and services to the market. There's no point in the productive capacity of an economy growing without the demand for the goods and services which are being produced also growing. Why produce goods and services if nobody wants to purchase them? So over time, as the supply of goods and services increases, it is critical that the demand for goods and services also increases too. What we then see over time is that it is the long-run supply of goods and services which determines how much is produced, but it is the demand for goods and services that will dictate at what price those goods and services are sold. If the demand for goods and services increases too rapidly, even though output is increasing, there could be quite extensive inflation in economies. Alright, that is then the end of this particular video, and I hope to do one also which will then cover the Phillips curve, which is the next session, sessions 14 and 15.